Julius Caesar again. He said, "The Britons are extremely superstitious, sacrificing animals and even humans to their gods." This is, of course, from his commentaries on the Gallic Wars again. And he has a much longer section here, which I'm going to read as well. "All the people of Gaul are completely devoted to religion, and for this reason, those who are greatly affected by disease and in the dangers of battle either sacrifice human victims or vow to do so using the Druids as administrators to these sacrifices, since it is judged that unless for a man's life is given back, the will of the immortal gods cannot be placated. In public affairs, they have instituted the same kind of sacrifice. Others have effigies of great size interwoven with twigs, the limbs of which are filled up with living people, which are set on fire from below, and the people are deprived of life, surrounded by flames. It is judged that the punishment of those who participate in theft or brigandage or other crimes are more pleasing to the immortal gods, but when the supply of this kind fail, they even go so low as to inflict punishment on the innocent." So that's an account of both Britain and modern-day France. And it seems like if Caesar is to be believed that they held similar views on human sacrifice. Of course, he's describing what we would call the Wicker Man there as well, which I recently rewatched in preparation for this.
The original 60s or 70s version?
73, I think it was, wasn't it?
Right, yeah. Because that's a good film.
It is a really good film,
it's a good film.
it? I do think it's playing off of the Christian fears of paganism a lot. It's playing off of those tropes and portraying them as far more evil than they would be. But of course, it's meant to be like that. It's the point of the film.
It's a suspense thriller, isn't it? Yeah, yeah. Because they remade it, didn't they, in recent times?
With Nicolas Cage in, yeah.
Right, I watched about an hour of that and turned it off.
I know.
Because I love the original. I don't love it, but it's a good film. It's a very good film. And the remake, I just couldn't.
The soundtrack is really good. They did a good job of trying to come up with some original Celtic-inspired folk ballads for it.
Like how Hot Fuzz is some sort of an homage or a comedy parody of it in some ways, isn't it, as well? Yeah. But one thing I want to say about human sacrifice is that you might think that, oh, well, they held life very cheap then. Any culture that does human sacrifice must be very cold and callous, like perhaps the Aztecs or something. I think you can argue that kind of the opposite is true. No, you want to offer the gods the most valuable thing there is.
Yeah, it's the ultimate sacrifice. When all else fails, then you offer up.
There's nothing more valuable than a human life, or even a child's life. So if you offer that to the gods, you're giving them the most valuable thing you give, in a sense. So I think that's worth noting.
Certainly for the Aztecs, we know that it was considered a great honour to be selected for human sacrifice. I know that's what they would say. Oh, yeah. Don't worry, you're such a hero, you're saving everyone. But it's not necessarily seen with the same taboo as we rightly see it today, I might add.
Yeah, because again, in the sort of the Greco-Roman world, it was very, very frowned upon. From the earliest times, human sacrifice was synonymous with being a barbarian. That you are uncultured, uncivilised if you would even dream of doing such a thing.
The Romans are a bit hypocritical on this, of course, because of the way in which they treated foreign kings in their triumphs, which triumph is basically a religious ceremony as much as it is a political one. I want to say, I know that's a bit out of an out there statement, but
I know what you're getting at.
It has religious significance, doesn't it? The person in the triumph paints their face red to resemble Mars, right? So there's clearly a religious element to it, and at the end they kill the foreign king. So Vercingetorix, for example, was strangled to death at the end of Caesar's triumph over Gaul.
Yeah.
So the fact he can turn his nose up at human sacrifice when he's far more than willing to have it happen when it's in veneration of him.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of contradictions of that type, though, aren't there? Just for an example, Christians say, thou shalt not kill, but then the Crusaders would, though. There's interest in when some crusading knights sort of asked their priests about that very thing. Like, didn't Moses say we're not supposed to ever take a human life? And yet the Pope's asking us to do exactly that. So who's right? So yeah, you can have cultures and civilizations that are completely contradictory, and yet, well, that's what humans are like, though, aren't they? Complicated and contradictory.
Well, yeah, hypocrisy is present everyone, more or less. Like it, I'm sure it's present in myself. I'm not aware enough to know it. It's impossible though to be perfectly consistent. So I don't know why I'm pulling them up on it. But moving on to Strabo, he says the Romans put a stop to both to these customs and to the ones connected with sacrifice and divination, as they were in conflict with our own ways. For example, they would strike a man who had been consecrated for sacrifice in the back with a sword and make prophecies based on his death spasms, and they would not sacrifice without the presence of druids. Other kinds of human sacrifices have been reported as well. Some men would shoot dead with arrows and impale in their temples, or would construct a huge figure of straw and wood, and having thrown cattle and all manner of wild animals and humans into it, they would make a burnt offering of the whole thing. So
Again, shades of Wicker Man, isn't it? Really?
It is, yeah.
Again.
Obviously, he would have been aware at this point of Caesar's accounts, so it's not necessarily supporting him per se, because it could just be using Caesar as a source for the latter thing. The thing that's interesting and relevant here is what he says about striking them in the back with a sword, because I'm going to look at a bog body in a minute, not literally look at it, but talk about it, and we're going to see that we seem to have some sort of archaeological evidence for this, if these are genuine sacrifices, which of course is disputable, because there are some people who would argue that there isn't conclusive archaeological evidence to suggest that there were any human sacrifices taking place at all, because it's difficult to establish the difference between whether it was an intentional sacrifice or whether it was just a murder when you're looking at purely the archaeology.
Or just a secular execution of any stripe, right?
And I think that that's a fair concern, but I don't necessarily agree with the notion that they didn't take place at all. I think that that's probably going a bit too far. I think they were probably less common than you would intuitively imagine. It's not like, oh, I've got a bad back, go cut off that person's head to make me feel better. I don't think it'd be done flippantly. I think it would be done in exceptional circumstances, and I think that the scant archaeological evidence for it is reflective of the fact that it was a last-ditch thing in a lot of cases.
Right, yeah. I mean, they'll make all sorts of sacrifices, not just of human life. For example, quite a lot of archaeological evidence we have that comes from bogs, peat bogs, that preserve things quite well, particularly flesh, organic things, or like good archaeological evidence, like swords and things that are found at the bottom of rivers, because they would quite often throw their most precious things into a bog or into a river.
Talking about those.
Oh, sorry, I've got ahead of you.
That's all right. I'm not going to talk about them too much, though. I'm just going to talk about some examples we found in Britain.
Right. Okay.
But onto the Irish, from both oral, written, and presumably some archaeological evidence as well, there was a tradition of sacrificing ancient Irish kings who were deemed as bad. I can't believe I'm going to say this. There have been a couple of cases now of bodies in Ireland of Celtic aristocrats who've had their nipples cut off. And according to Ned Kelly, not the Australian bushranger, but the keeper of antiquities at the National Museum of Ireland, said that sucking a king's nipple was a gesture of submission in ancient Ireland, which seems very counterintuitive to me, but I can understand in that it's harkening back to when you were a baby and you were dependent on your mother.
I can just about see it.
It's very strange. I don't know why that would be the thing to do. What's wrong with bowing or kneeling or prostrating oneself? You don't have to be as weird as that, but each to their own, I suppose. But Mr. Kelly says that cutting them would have made him incapable of kingship in this world or the next. So it
That
seems
makes
like
sense.
there was a deliberate reason for this. That's why they believed that the bodies that they found in Ireland were former kings that had done a bad job. There was a mention of a man who was something like 6'7", who had his nipples chopped off and had been seemingly brutally sacrificed. And obviously, him being a beast of a man probably explains why he was king as well. Because, of course, being 6'7" that far in the past is absurd.
It does make sense, though. It does make sense if those were the signs of kingliness or kingship. Well, then cut them off. Then, two things spring to mind in the genocide of Rwanda, where certain like having very long fingers was a sign of your ethnicity, so they'd chop your fingers off. Or in the Byzantine era, you couldn't really be an emperor if your nose and ears had been cut off. You just simply couldn't. And so they'd cut your nose and ears off to prevent you from ever...
I've always been curious about that, because obviously I know about the golden nose side of things, but what was the significance of the nose and ears?
Well, there wasn't any special significance. It was just that if you were deformed like that,
Okay.
it was just proof positive that you were a failure on some level, that you'd failed in your charge of being a ruler to the point where your enemies could have done that to you. Well, it's proof positive that, of course, there is an exception, Justinian II, where that happened to him. He was knocked off his perch. He was dethroned. His enemies cut his nose off, sent him into exile, and then years later, he had a renaissance. His career had a renaissance, and he came back. He was wearing a golden nose strapped to his face. So there are examples. It wasn't always the case, but nearly always that's the case. Or if he had a princeling that was a pretender, well, just to make sure he never achieved his dreams, you could cut both his ears off, say.
I know that there's a tendency in ancient cultures to geld people, make them a eunuch so they couldn't become a monarch, obviously, because of the lack of succession, right?
Right, yeah.
So that was another common thing.
Yeah.
But to complicate the Irish dilemma, I suppose, is the fact that there's not really too much mention of human sacrifice in Irish mythology. There's only one clear instance where there is an example of a high king who set up an idol to sacrifice children to, but the Druids put a stop to it by murdering him. So the notion that somehow these human sacrifices were being encouraged by the Druids here, at least according to this mythology, seems to be disputed a little bit. I think that certainly the Druids' roles as a judge for criminals and things like that, because of course we've got lots of accounts of them supposedly being judicial in who deserves what. So perhaps they were the ones sanctioning the execution of criminals. That's sort of the apologetic side of it. But I think that it's probably likely that they did sacrifice people for better outcomes, better harvests maybe, success in wars.
Once again, we don't know about any of this in fantastic detail because there's no sort of literary evidence, but what does play out throughout all sorts of cultures and civilizations throughout all of history is a friction between the rulers, whether it's a king or a pharaoh or whatever, of just a lord, and their priestly caste. It just plays out again and again and again and again, that there's tension between them. Perhaps in England's one of the most famous cases, Henry II and Thomas Becket. But that's just one tiny example. It's sort of endless. Right there, it seems like there's sort of the fingerprints of something like that going on, that the king wanted to do something and his priestly class, the Druids, had enough power in this instance to just be, well, no, we'll bump you off if you try and do that.
Well, I think in that instance, they're probably right. If you create an idol to sacrifice children, you probably deserve to be killed.
Well, yeah. Well, yeah, to you or I, right, yeah. Yeah.
But moving on to an instance of human sacrifice in Britain, because there is a specific case, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, of Lindo Man.
I am familiar with it. I'm really... I'll let you talk about it and describe it, and then I'll tell you why I'm so familiar with it.
Okay.
But go ahead.
So he's also known as Pete Marsh, as a bit of a joke, obviously. He was discovered in a peat bog in Lindo Moss near Wimslow in Cheshire. Supposedly he was in his mid-20s and his body maintained a trimmed beard and moustache and sideburns, and he had brown hair as well as healthy teeth with no visible cavities and manicured fingernails, which of course indicates that he did little manual labour. Other than a fox fur armband, he was discovered completely naked, and on his skin there were elevated levels of copper, which may be from a copper-based paint put on his skin. Supposedly he also had mistletoe pollen in his stomach, which not only suggests he died in the spring, either March or April, when mistletoe produces that pollen, but of course mistletoe is a plant of religious significance and you wouldn't ingest that accidentally. One, because mistletoe is poisonous, so he would have known that as well. Living in a Celtic society, you would certainly know what mistletoe is, and you certainly wouldn't eat it because you'd know that it would be dangerous. So the fact that there's the pollen in there, that was deliberately placed there, wasn't it? Probably consumed as some sort of religious rite.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah, the groves, particularly in Britain, were described in the ancient sources as mistletoe festooned. It's definitely a druidic religious thing to mistletoe. Sorry, go on.
So he had a severe head injury at the back of his head and ligature marks around his neck from a cord and what appears to be a V-shaped stab wound in his neck. It's difficult to establish, though, which of these injuries happened through the decomposition. Certainly, the ligature marks on his neck could have happened from having like a cord around your neck after dying. It doesn't necessarily mean he was strangled by it, it's just the impression and the effect it has on a dead body when it's in that state. Certainly, a V-shaped stab wound, that could have still happened after decomposition, but it's perhaps more likely that it was some sort of death wound, because of course they did die a violent death. We know that much, but I think the injuries to the back of the head is my kind of suspicion, because of course Strabo says that is the manner in which they dispatched their sacrifices, and lo and behold, we have someone who appears to be sacrificed with a wound on the back of the head. So that's possible. He was also found face down, which is consistent with striking someone in the back of the head. The V-shaped stab wound in his neck may have happened first, and maybe they got him up and then finished him off by hitting him on the back of the head. But either way, I think that the back of the head was the final thing before dropping face first into the bog. So obviously there's a bit of a dispute around that. And I've not been able to find the original source, so I'm going to read an extract from Wikipedia, but I can believe that it's genuine, because it's just the account of two people who are at the University of London. So it reads as follows. According to Anne Ross, a scholar of Celtic history, and Don Robbins, a chemist at the University of London, Lindo Man was likely a sacrifice victim of extraordinary importance. They identified his stomach contents as including the undigested remains of a partially burned barley griddle cake. You still have griddle cakes to this day, actually. Of a kind used by the ancient Celts to select victims for sacrifice. Such cakes were torn into fragments and placed in a sack, after which all candidates for sacrifice would withdraw a piece, with the one withdrawing the burnt piece being the one who would be sacrificed. They argued that Lindo Man was likely a high-ranking druid who was sacrificed in a last-ditch effort to call upon the aid of three Celtic gods to stop a Roman offensive against the Celts in AD 60.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.